Señoras y señores, comunidad universitaria, muy buenos días. A nombre de la Universidad de Guadalajara, del Centro Universitario de Ciencias Económico-Administrativas, sean todos ustedes bienvenidos en mérito de este webinar, titulado Climate Capitalism and the Transformation of Global Economy. Y para dar inicio formal, me permito nombrar las distinguidas personalidades que nos honran con su presencia. Agradecemos al Dr. Matthew Paterson, de la Universidad de Manchester. Asimismo, agradecemos la presencia del maestro José Manuel Leal. De igual manera, como moderadora de este evento nos acompaña la doctora Carla Aceves. Reiteramos el saludo a todos ustedes y les anunciamos que pueden consultar en webinars.cucea.udg.mx los seminarios llevados a cabo y próximos a emitirse. Ahora bien, dejo en el uso de la voz a la doctora Carla Aceves.
Muy buenos días. Muy buenos días, muchas gracias a todos quienes se conectan y nos acompañan esta mañana por redes sociales. Doy la más cordial bienvenida al profesor Matthew Paterson y al maestro José Manuel Leal, quien será nuestro presentador esta mañana. Y yo les agradezco mucho por conectarse a esta conferencia inaugural del calendario 2020B de la Maestría en Relaciones Económicas Internacionales y Cooperación de posgrados CUCEA. En razón de ser un evento proyectado para la maestría, este evento será conducido totalmente en inglés. Sin embargo, podrán enviarnos sus preguntas por vía Face, toda vez que van a estar siendo monitorizadas. Sus preguntas podrán ser enviadas tanto en inglés como en español. Y yo agradezco mucho su participación. And I welcome once again Professor Matthew Paterson, who is joining from Manchester University this morning. And in order to give the floor to Dr. Paterson for the beginning of our lecture, Climate Capitalism and the Global Transformation and the Transformation of Global Economy, I will give the floor first to Professor José Manuel Leal, who will kindly introduce Professor Paterson. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good evening to you, Matthew. Glad to be back at home. So I'm gonna take a few minutes to introduce Professor Paterson. I hope to be fair and just focusing on some things, not all. He has a lot of experience, but anyhow, Professor Matthew Paterson, as Professor Carla Aceves already mentioned, he's at the University of Manchester at the School of Social Sciences, and he did his master's on climate change politics at Essex University in the UK back in the day. Also, he's a member of the British International Studies Association and a senior researcher fellow of the Earth System Governance. I will try to give a fair and brief summary of his publications and just aligned to today's conferences. And among his most important are books, Global Warming and Global Politics, Understanding Global Environmental Politics, Domination, Accumulation, and Resistance, Automobile Politics, Ecology and Cultural Politics, Cultural Political Economy, Climate Capitalism, Global Warming and the Transformation of the Global Economy with Peter Newell, Transnational Climate Change Governance, together with 9 other authors, Thinking Ecologically About Global Political Economy with Ryan Katz-Rosin. He has also edited 7 books and journals, special issues. Among them are Against Automobile, Cultural Political Economy, The Politics of Carbon Market, Toward a Cultural and Political Politics of Climate Change, Device, Size, and Descent. Professor Paterson has also published and co-authored 47 academic journal articles. Among the most important are Trump, US Climate Politics and the Evolving Pattern of Global Climate Governance with Robert McNeil. Also, he has the political economy of decarbonization from green energy race to green division of labor with Eric Lachapelle. neoliberal climate policy from markets fetishism to the development of developmental state with Robert McNeill, and Virtuous Carbon with Johann Stripes. Who and what are carbon markets for? Politics and the development of climate politics. Car culture and global environmental politics. Some other 46 book chapters. Theoretical perspectives on international environmental politics with Michelle Bettil, Caroline Hochester, and Dimitri Stives. Also, the impact, a climate of crisis, the impact of the economic crisis on European Union climate change politics, with in Jones, Devars, and Krina Viju, the economic crisis in Europe. Also, with Peter Newell, the politics of the carbon economy, with in the politics of climate change with Maxwell Boydluck, and so on, so on. He has also edited, he is a co-editor of the Review of International Students, Studies, member of editorial board of Global Environmental Politics. He is co-editor with Jennifer Clapp with in Global Environmental Politics, a member of the editorial board for the Studies in Political Economy. He's co-editor with, jointly with Graham Smith for the Environmental Politics series in Routledge Associate. He's also associate editor for Global Environmental Politics. And again, so many others, more of the highest and well-recognized journals on global politics, environmental politics, and global environmental politics. He has supervised more than 20 postdoctorals and doctoral students, including me, and teaches courses in the fields of dimension of environmental politics, international political economy, environmental and political economy. Besides academia, Professor Paterson also participates in several think tanks, academic enterprise, and knowledge transfers. He was a lead author for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 5th assessment report. He's also a blog contributor, fellow at a broader institute and Canadian policy think tank, the Center of International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. He at least used to be a regular radio and TV contributor for CBC, Canadian Broadcast Company, obviously Canada. He has a lot of several contributions to policy debates and dialogues for, among others, the Friedrich Elbers and Stephen Global Green Growth Best Practice Initiative in South Korea. Also Sustainable Prosperity in Canada, Canadian Centre for Political Alternatives, Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, Embassy of South Korea in Ottawa, Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development in Ottawa, and Ecology Ottawa. He has served as external body examiner. He's member of the Political Science Committee of Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada, among many, many, many other things. Last but not least, he's a great thesis supervisor. He's a great professor. He's a musician and a gardener. And anyhow, we're very glad to have you here. Looking forward to hear the conference, and I'll give the floor back to Professor Aceves.
Thank you very much, Professor Leal. We're definitely very fortunate to have Professor Matthew Paterson this morning with us. I remind you that we will be monitoring your questions via Facebook Live. Professor Paterson will proceed with his lecture, and we will proceed afterwards with 1 or 2 rounds or questions. So feel free to send us your questions in English or Spanish through Facebook, and we will get them through to Professor Paterson. With no more preamble, I proceed to give the floor to Professor Matthew Paterson from Manchester University of Manchester. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Just get this sharing. Okay, well, thank you first and foremost for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to all of you for coming, who I can't see because I'm in Zoom and you're in Facebook Live, and that's quite confusing. But anyway, and thank you to José Manuel for the introduction, which made me sound extremely busy. I assure you I didn't do all those things at one go. That's 30 years worth of work, not all those things happening at the same time. Nevertheless, it was a very nice introduction. Thank you. And I'm going to hope to do some of that experience justice in what I talk about over the next 50 minutes or so. So, climate capitalism and the transformation of the global economy. Climate capitalism, as José Manuel intimated, is a sort of phrase that Pete Newell and I coined in a book that came out 10 years ago. And what we mean when we use that phrase, and that's going to guide some of the things I talk about, is the idea that there's a sort of lots and lots of people think there is a basic problem of thinking that we can deal with climate change adequately within the context of a capitalist global economy. Right? So there are some features of how capitalism works that means that we might not be able to address capitalism adequately. And so the idea of climate capitalism is to ask a question of whether or not climate change can be dealt with within capitalist conditions, given that's the sort of world we live in. And at least to ask a provisional, to give a provisional, very provisional yes answer to that question. Maybe it can. At least we can't assume definitively that it cannot. If it can't, then also there's as we will see in what I'm going to talk about over the next 50 minutes, there's a massive problem because we live in a world which is capitalist. It arguably is not going to change that radically, that quickly. And so we may be in all sorts of trouble if that can't at least have a go at responding. So that's the general terrain of what I'm going to be talking about today, and it's sort of exemplified a little bit by the background to the slides you see, an oil rig and the sun, and which sort of encapsulates whether or not capitalism can move from the oil rig to the sun as its fundamental source of energy. Now it doesn't want to let me change slides that way. Okay, so that's a rough plan of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to pose the question as a fairly stark choice about the next future, certainly within your lifetimes, if not within mine, that we face a fairly stark choice globally between collapse and transformation. Some ways you could say it's transformation either way around, but it's the transformation that societies start to collapse because of climate change impacts becoming ever more severe, or that we do transform the global economy through acting on climate change successfully. And then I move on to sort of coming back to this question of what is the relationship, or what are the relationships between climate change and capitalism, with those bullets there. And then after doing that as a sort of general level, I'm going to give a couple of examples of how that connection works out in practice, one of which is to think about carbon markets, about which I've done quite a lot of research over the years, and the other is to say a few things about global trade and climate politics, partly because I know that you're in a course that speaks to where trade is one of your important themes. And then I'm going to say a few things right at the end about the current crisis, COVID and so on, and whether that's an opportunity to set societies set the global economy on a new path. Okay, so I think the starkest way to understand the challenge of climate change and why it's crucially important is that it's now more or less, I think, the scientific consensus of most climate scientists that we have to encounter the possibility that human civilization on a global scale will collapse in the course of the next century, course of your lifetimes anyway. And you will have often seen the possibility of avoiding this expressed in terms of trying to limit climate change within a certain temperature range. Sometimes I'll say 2 degrees higher than industrial levels, sometimes I'll say 1.5 degrees higher than levels. And I would think the dominant position now is that we really need to try and keep it within 1.5 degrees centigrade. No higher than that compared to pre-industrial revolution levels. Now that's the trouble with the 1.5 degrees target is that that is almost certainly already missed, right? We are currently about a degree above pre-industrial level temperature levels, and there are large time lags in the system, right? So emissions that we are making today are going to cause climate change over the next, say, 40 odd years, right? And so the warming that we've had to date is all with the emissions through till around 1980, 1990 or so. And we have emitted half of all the emissions ever made have happened since 1990, right? So we're committed to a large degree of extra warming already, whatever we do now. And the general consensus from the last IPCC report, the one that was focused on the idea of limiting greenhouse gases to, climate change to 1.5 degrees, is that we're currently headed on probably for a world that's 3 to 4 degrees warmer. And just to give you some hints of this, I'm not, going to give too much, but this can imply in large parts of the world collapse of food systems, the ability to feed ourselves, a great acceleration of the intensification of extreme weather situations, floods, hurricanes, etc., both in terms of frequency and intensity, accelerating sea level rise and surges. You might have seen it, you will see if you're looking, fairly recurrent mentions now of big chunks of ice falling off a Greenland ice sheet or an Antarctic ice sheet, and those are accelerating in ways, and usually happening faster than the models predicted. Right? So if anything, the scientific consensus is too cautious, not too alarmist. And also, highly relevant in our current context, rapidly changing disease patterns. Lots of diseases that have been eliminated, either from some parts of the world or in general, are now starting to come back. And climate change creates the conditions under which those diseases can move around the world much more rapidly. Of course, combined with the way that our global economy works, that we get to move around through planes and trade and so on. The other point to make about this sort of idea of a 1.5 degree target is that there's a sort of, the climate system can be understood to work in terms of having critical thresholds and positive feedbacks, right? So there are a number of things that might kick in around 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial or 2 degrees, things like a whole load of methane that sits underneath the Arctic, right, and below the seabed. And there's already evidence that that is starting to seep out faster than it was before. Or in the tundra in Canada and Russia, in the land, in the permafrost, that's got a lot of methane sat in it, and as that starts to melt, it increases methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas, and what that might mean then is you get to a point of no return where we cannot even rein it back, climate change back, even if we start to cut our emissions. And the final point about the collapse point is then to sort of say, well, if that's one possibility, global civilizational collapse, to put it really starkly, then what is the speed of the necessary emissions cuts to avoid that? And so here's 2 slides, one very, these are very schematic. You'll find more sophisticated versions of that, but the crude versions work for the purposes today. This is greenhouse gas emissions over the last 200 years and how fast they've grown, right? The black line is the total. The green line is coal, which is the vast majority of it for most of that period. You'll see, sort of ironic that they have coal as green, but there you go. The blue line is oil, and the red line is natural gas. And then there's cement production and gas flaring right at the bottom, but they're much smaller. So you can see an exponential rise in that. And you can also see that the vast majority of that is associated with fossil fuel use. This is where emissions would have to come down, right? So if the green line on the left-hand side is essentially the black line in the previous one, going up very sharply, now they have to come down even more sharply. So in about a 60-year period, come down to the level that they were 200 years ago. So a very rapid downslope. Now, all of those variants are according to different assumptions about what the temperature target is, or what our assumptions about how sensitive, how quickly the climate will respond if we do start to reduce our emissions. But they all tell the same story. We have to get to emissions to zero. As you will see, they probably mean we actually have to get emissions to below zero. And so this, if you've seen this idea of negative emissions, that starts to come into play. And we have to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's a massive challenge to be able to meet those targets. And if we don't, we risk the quite significant possibility of global societal collapses. Okay. The flip side of this is to understand that acting on climate change is fundamentally transformational, right? We saw in the slide a couple of slides ago, the fossil fuel emissions are the central thing. Now, fossil fuel from coal, oil and natural gas, everything depends on energy, right? This meeting does not happen unless we have electricity. The fact that I lived in Canada for 12 years, including supervising José Manuel, that ability to move around the world depends on oil for planes, for trains, for cars, etc. We heat our homes, we cook our food, we grow our food. Everything depends on energy. And the vast majority of the energy that's provided, including for this meeting, is still coming from fossil fuels, right? So the electricity that you're running will come, at least in large part, from coal, although I don't know electricity's coal mix. In the UK, we've actually more or less got rid of coal, but we still have lots of natural gas in our fuel mix, for example. So everything depends on energy and everything we do in daily life. It also, that even if we dealt with the energy question, which is probably about 80% of the problem, there are lots of emissions coming from beyond energy. And if we have to get to basically zero emissions, we have to deal with all of it, right? The really significant ones of these are beef and dairy, which produce, so cattle, sheep and goats are all significant producers of methane. And most of the cattle, sheep and goats that exist in the world are because we farm them and raise them for both meat and milk. And so there's a massive issue there about our daily consumption of both the meat and the milk involved in that. Cement and steel both produce emissions, partly because they're very energy intensive, and so the fossil fuel emissions but partly because there is also CO2 being produced in the production process itself. And there's loads of challenges, technical challenges in dealing with that. And finally, also agricultural fertilizers, and lots of our modern agricultural systems depend on these external fertilizer inputs, which themselves are significant sources of greenhouse gases that we have to get to zero. And so it's hugely complex. It deals with pretty much every aspect of any life. Anything you want to ask about what you do in your daily life, you will be able to connect it to climate change, causing climate change, right? It's not because you or I or anybody is individually failing. It's because we live in this large complex system that we'll call capitalism. And so the final point about that is there is no single magic technology. Anybody who comes along and says, I know the magic solution, we just need to put everybody on nuclear power, is a charlatan, to be frank. Right? It's hugely complex, requires lots of detailed interventions to try and transform these complex systems of transport, electricity, housing, city planning, food production, and so on. So it really does, you may have seen a book by Naomi Klein, a well-known Canadian activist and author, a few years about climate change called This Changes Everything, right? So it's a series of multi-dimensional transformations, right? So in the narrow sense of the economy, all sorts of key sectors from the fossil fuel sector itself to high energy consuming sectors like steel and lots of metals production, plastics production, and so on, are all deeply embedded in producing climate change. So all of the stages of an economic cycle of investment, production, consumption are involved and need to be transformed. It's a cultural and social transformation, right? Just think about what your life would be, for those of you who still eat meat, which will be most people listening, if you were not able to eat beef or dairy. What is involved in that transformation? Immediately, lots of people, I know, because I've done these talks before, sitting there saying, I'm never not going to do that, right? I'm not a vegetarian, I'm, whatever. And so we immediately sense a strong sense of resistance to those changes in our daily life. But they're pretty much, we don't know how to do it without that change at the moment, right? So our daily life, whether it's how we get about, whether it's what we eat and how we eat it, whether it's where we live, how that housing is heated, what temperature we think is comfortable, and so on. All of those things have to be challenged. It's political. It's about the power of the corporations in the oil sector or the coal sector to resist change. We've seen lots of that, right? It's also about new forms of mobilization, right? Some of you may be involved in a school strike on climate, or know people who have at least, or seen them and either been inspired or sort of annoyed by them, depending on your perspective. But we see these new forms of activism coming along because of that. And we also think of, and it's also going to entail huge changes in geopolitics. If we have an economy, a global economy not where oil plays no role anymore, then it's hard to see how the geopolitics of the Middle East, for example, will not be anything other than radically different, right? Because the ability of the regimes that get lots and lots of power and wealth from that oil to throw their weight around will be very different. And the interests of external powers like the United States to intervene in those regions will be different. Conversely, if you think about an electric future, especially those bits that rely on batteries, lithium is going to be central. And lithium, 75% of the lithium in the world is in 2 countries, Chile and Australia. Right? So suddenly you can imagine a completely different geopolitical world where those 2 countries become the target. Lots and lots of people, China, US, Russia, whoever, are going to be very, very interested in Australia and Chile in the future. It's not that they weren't necessarily in some, certainly Chile, as you'll know, lots of history of American intervention there already, but that will become more acute, it seems to me. And finally, it's a technological challenge. There are a few areas where big technological breakthroughs are still needed. We have no idea, really, that's totally true, but we don't really know whether or not we can actually still fly, right? There are some experiments in solar flights and electric planes, but they're really early stages and nobody knows if it can be done at scale, right? We really, again, we have a few interventions with ruminant agriculture to try and reduce the amounts of methane by changing their diet and so on, but we don't know if we can do that at scale in any serious way. Steel is another area, battery life is another area where there are significant improvements in the technology of batteries for cars, for other uses, for storing electricity that comes from intermittent sources like wind would be really important. But mostly actually the technological challenges are about implementing technologies we already have, right? We know actually how to run a low carbon transport system. A lot of it involves getting people out of their cars in the first place, in those places where cars are really dominant, right? The bicycles are really good low carbon technology, right? So you don't need any technical intervention to do that, right? But you do need lots and lots of social change to do with how we use those technologies, right? And again, that's back to the cultural and social point. Lots of people really like driving their cars and don't want to change, right? So it's transformative in all sorts of ways, and it can't be reduced to one of those. So if you ever find yourself having that, all we need to do is solve this one problem, you need to resist that idea because it's much more complicated than that. Okay, what do we think about this in relation to, or how do we connect this to thinking about capitalism? Right? The first point is to say that capitalism and the global economy can be really importantly understood as the origin of climate change, right? So if we go back to the sources of climate change and the sources of that graph where I showed the rise, where if you remember back, I'll maybe show that again, right? Through till the early 20th century, all of the emissions were coming from coal. Okay, and the coal was central, therefore, to the industrial revolution that started in Britain in the late 18th century, sorry, and Britain was really the only seriously industrial country through to the 1830s, 1840s, then joined by other countries in Northwest Europe, then by the United States, and then other parts of the world, right? And it didn't start with coal, but the transition to coal was because when industrial employers in the steel, in the cotton mills around Manchester, including in the small town I live in outside Manchester, still there's old mills, in the ironworks in the West Midlands and around Birmingham in the UK, in steel and then steel industries and elsewhere. The way those things coal became really central to that is because the employers, coal was very effective at controlling the workforce and doing their business more effectively. It wasn't because it was cheaper. Coal, of course, cost money. Those mills in and around Manchester, prior to that, were running on water. Water's free. It was just running through the rivers, and they just had a little water mill, and they could run their mills perfectly happy from a technical point of view. But they could control the workforce more effectively if they put a steam engine in. They could also move the mills away from the water if they put us, and so they had a bit more control over where they placed them. They could put them near to where the workforce was easily exploited, and so on. So the reasons we had a shift to coal in the first place during the Industrial Revolution was because it was in the interests of capitalists to do so, not because coal is intrinsically better than water at doing the jobs that were being done. Right? Another aspect to this is to think about how so the spread of coal was because it was good for the development of the capitalist economy, which was happening as it industrialized during the 19th century and then globally after that. The other aspect in way in which it was central to the sort of geopolitical or imperial politics and dynamics between European countries as they spread their power globally. They'd already done so, obviously, going back to the 16th century across the Americas, but then the spread during the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, first in South and Southeast Asia, and then in Africa. Oil became increasingly central to the ability for European states, Britain, France, the United States to an extent as well, to do that, right? So the British Navy was famously shifted onto oil just before the First World War by the British government, and that in order to be able to outcompete the French or the Germans militarily and control the seas and keep their empire intact, right? And therefore that's one of the reasons why areas like the Middle East, where a lot of the oil was to be found, became the sources of lots and lots of political competition to control those territories. And the final point to say about this is then to think, if we think about capitalism, one of the things that defines capitalism as an economy is it's an economy that depends fundamentally on economic growth, right? If you think about the definition of an economic crisis in the world we live in, it's a crisis of growth, right? It's what policymakers think all the time, or corporate owners, or even individual citizens. The thing to avoid is the lack of growth, GDP, as measured by GDP. Right? And that's partly because the nature of capitalism is to be enormously dynamic, right? There's never been a society like it prior to the late 18th century as it started to get global. It's been enormously dynamic, generates technological innovation, but it's also enormously unstable, right? We're going into an economic crisis for slightly different reasons now than some of the normal ones, but nevertheless, it's a crisis nonetheless. And so policymakers normally routinely thinking about how can I keep the economy growing. That's an overriding preoccupation for lots of people in government. And one of the things that they know, it's an absolute standard assumption, that there is a very close linear relationship between the use of energy and the question of economic growth. So if you are going to promote growth, pretty much everybody assumes that you have to increase the amount of energy in the system. And historically, of course, all of that energy has been fossil fueled, right? So this is from the website Gapminder. If you've ever come across it, it's very good to play around. You can go on and play around this. You can see this. This is just a screenshot, and you'll see CO2 emissions on the x-axis and per person, and income per person. Each of these little bubbles is an individual country, and the color codings give you regions, right? I think you can see the regions up on the left, right? So the yellow ones are in the Americas. So the one at the top right is the United States, with the big yellow one is in the United States. The big red one, oh, hang on a sec. This is, yeah. So the size of a bubble is the total amount of emissions, because it's per capita emissions times per capita income. Am I getting that right? Anyway, doesn't matter. The size of the bubble is roughly correlating to the total size of emissions. You'll also see, for those of you, because I understand that lots of you are economic students, so you'll understand this, these are log scales, right? So it's producing a linear thing that if it was on an unlogged scale, it would be an exponential rise, but you wouldn't be able to visualize that in a single sheet, hence we use the log scale. What you see there is, on the one hand, quite a lot of in-group variation. So if you look at, let's say, 5 tons per person, you've got quite a wide range of income for which that emissions level goes up, and ditto across, right? For the same amount of income, you can have quite a wide range of variation in the total amount of emissions, but the pattern globally is still very strong, right? You can draw a very good line of best fit in that. You can run a regression on that and you'll get a really good solid score. So GDP and per capita emissions correlate really, really, really closely. And that's still the case despite all sorts of efforts to try and decouple them. So that's a sort of one context. So the second way to think about the relationship between capitalism is just to say capitalism is the world we live in. It's the social system within which we have to respond. As we've just seen, if you ask what governments want to do, you know, first time, every time you propose something on climate policy, they will immediately be asking, how much is it going to impact economic growth? Right? So lots and lots of climate projects that you'll come across will be often focused on promoting growth, precisely because they're worried about that. And if they don't promote growth, they might not be accepted. It's also, of course, the case, which the previous slide shows as well, is that there are huge global inequalities which affect the climate political dynamics, right? The per capita emissions here range between about 50, right? These little green ones, these will all be the oil producing states in the Gulf, right? This is Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and so on. And here you've got about 20. So these two yellow ones here, you can't see where I'm pointing, but the big yellow one and the tiny yellow one just below it are going to be the United States and Canada. And the red one right next to the smaller yellow one is going to be Australia, I'm pretty sure. Right? So these are emitting at about 20 tons per capita. Mexico, I would be guessing which one it is. I assume it's one of the two middle bubbles here in this middle section. One of them will be Mexico, one of them will be Brazil. So they're emitting way down to sort of 4 tons per capita. I suspect Mexico's per capita emissions are actually higher than that now. I'm not sure what the date is for this particular screenshot I took, sorry. You'll be able to find that out, it's easy to find. And then way down here, you've got lots of these blue dots, which are mostly countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have countries with less than a ton per person. Right? So between the rich countries like the USA and a country like Chad or Sudan in sub-Saharan Africa, are 20-fold different in per capita emissions. So huge inequalities in who causes the problem, but also who bears the brunt of the impact. We also, though, live in a particular form of capitalism. Capitalism is not always the same across time and space, and we tend to call the current version neoliberalism. And the particular logics of neoliberalism in relation as a context for thinking about how we act on climate change are, one is that it's very dominated, I'm going to say these in the opposite order, it's very dominated by finance. 50, finance was really irrelevant as a part of the global economy. Really, it had been really subordinated. Governments, there were lots and lots of restrictions on financial activity. Now it's the opposite. And one of the effects of that is that the financial sector is one of the important sectors that has to be appeased, but also has been highly innovative on climate, right? Develop new financial products, try to govern, do all sorts of private sector governance activity to try and affect climate change for its own interests. And the other thing is that governments have done policy initiatives to promote action on climate change that favour finance, right? So carbon markets, which I'm going to come back to later on, are one of the dominant ways that climate governments have responded. I'm going to leave the last point because I'm aware that I probably need to crack on. So those two points there, capitalism is the origin of climate change, capitalism is the sort of context we have to deal with climate change within, raise the question for lots of people, can capitalism respond adequately, right? And if not, are there alternatives? Now, one question that helps us think about that is going to be, is capitalism sufficiently flexible, right? So historically, it is absolutely the case that capitalism has developed fundamentally using fossil fuels and they've been integral to its development. But could it, in fact, does that mean it has to be based on fossil fuels? Some people think yes, some people think only oil, coal has the sufficient level of energy density to be able to do that, and solar and wind and other sources of energy can't do that adequately. but others, that's a genuine point of disagreement about whether that's possible or not. But it's also a question, for example, within capitalism about how much previously existing patterns of development have meant that lots and lots of that there are sectors in the economy which are so powerful that they can actually block change, right? So there'd be an argument that the oil sector or the coal industry is powerful enough that actually capitalism cannot become fully renewable because of the embedded power of those interests. Right? A second thing to think that we need to think about is are the responses that work within the logic of capitalism self-defeating, right? So, for example, if you have to promote growth, does that mean that the gains you might make are undermined by the fact that the economy keeps growing? So, if you think about it at the moment, just to give some rough and ready numbers to that, to get on that downward path in the earlier slide I showed, we have to be globally, this is not individual countries, but globally, reducing our emissions by about 4% to 5% a year now, from now on. Now, that's in absolute terms, total numbers of emissions going down by that speed. Now, obviously, our emissions are still going up, and there's been very few years where, usually in points of crisis, right? Basically, there's only 1 year so far in global history where emissions have gone down where the global economy has grown, which was 2014. Otherwise, emissions only go down in the middle of a crash like in 2008-9, or at the moment. Emissions are going down quite radically at the moment. But so you have to get emissions down by about 5%. Even if the economy stayed stable, you would have to then improve the efficiency of the economy in terms of its emissions by about 5%. Now, if the global economy is growing by 2%, that raises it. Now, the compounding interest is going to be make this more complicated, but as a rough figure, it's going to mean it has to get more efficient by about 7% every year. Now, if you ask the question, how more efficient in emitting carbon does the global economy get at the moment, it's about 1%, right? So every year the global economy currently increases by grows by 2 to 3%. And it gets about 1% more efficient in its its emissions. So emissions grow by about 1 to 2%. In other words, 1%, 1 percentage point less than the 2 to 3% of growth. So you've got to accelerate the rate of that big scale technical change in how much more efficient the economy gets in its use of carbon by 5 or 6-fold. To get the sort of absolute cuts that we need. Even if the economy stays the same, it's 5%. It's a 5-fold increase, right? So there is an argument that growth makes it more difficult to do. At a more common level, again, this is for the bit. This will connect to the bits that you might be doing in economics, or those of you who've got an economics background. This is known as the rebound effect, or in an older language, the Jevons paradox. Jevons was one of the founders of modern economics in the late 19th century and wrote a book called The Coal Question, where his paradox question was, why does coal use go up when factories that are using coal are getting really, really much more efficient much more quickly, which was the case, right? The factories using coal were getting, their rates of energy efficiency improvements were really, really high, and yet coal use kept going up, right? Economists now tend to call this the rebound effect, right? The simple version is if I use energy more efficiently because I get a more efficient fridge, or I get a more efficient car, or whatever, then what happens to the money that I save? Right? Maybe I go on a cheap flight somewhere, in which case the total amount of energy and therefore emissions has gone up, not down, even though the efficiency of that individual product has got better, right? And the Jevons paradox is about thinking about this at the level of the system, right? The whole economy, not just the individual consumption act, right? So there's lots of reasons why it's quite difficult to think, or there are obstacles to actually realizing the rate of emissions reductions we might need. And a third question to come back to try and address the first one is to think about the power structures more explicitly, right? The large companies that benefit from the status quo have really strong, powerful interests to resist change. In the global context of those global inequalities, those countries that have very high emissions, have all sorts of reasons to try and avoid those emissions reductions and blame others, right? And you see geopolitical fights between the US and China over emissions all the time, like you do on other issues, and that expresses that very clearly. The petrostates, those states that are very heavily dependent on oil as a source of their export earnings, and Mexico has some oil exports, but nothing like some of the countries, let's say, in the Middle East. In the diplomatic context, have been very effective at preventing negotiations in the United Nations on climate change from proceeding in the way that lots of other countries have wanted them to. And the final question about this sort of dilemma is, of course, if for those people who are in favour of abandoning capitalism or think we have to abandon capitalism to deal with climate change, is a time question, right? Those emissions, that rate of cuts that I was talking about, people often use the rhetoric that we have 12 years to save the world. Well, that was a few years ago, actually. Now it's more like 9. We have to really start to get global emissions on that downward path. And that raises the question of how fast do social systems change in general, right? If you think we have to have a post-capitalist future, then capitalism took 300-400 years to become global. Is it possible to imagine that it's going to suddenly not exist in 20 years? So that's a rhetorical question, obviously, and I'll leave it hanging. So those are the types of questions I think that are important to think about when we want to connect the global economy, trade, or any of its specific bits, whether that's trade or finance or production or whatever, to thinking about the problem of climate change. I'm going to give a couple of examples. Am I okay for time for another 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Is that, yeah, okay. So one important one that I alluded to earlier on is the idea that sort of carbon markets have become a dominant response, and they fit the logic of capitalism, right? They are responses to climate change that are really obviously benefit the interests of certain sectors of the economy. In some senses, they were driven by governments deliberately deciding they wanted to favour the interests of finance in particular, and also that it was a way of regulating carbon and trying to bring carbon emissions down in a way that intruded the least on the industries that were going to be regulated. So electricity, steel, all of the big industries that have been the target of most of these carbon market systems. Right. I'll focus mostly on the European Union ETS, partly because it's emissions trading system, because it's the biggest in the world still. We may end up one in the next couple of years with one in China, which could become bigger, although it's still, the Chinese one is still fairly modest at the moment. But I'm going to just quite quickly give a brief history and explain the logic of them and how they fit this idea of thinking them as a capitalist response. Right? So we've got two types. The first point to say is that there are two types of carbon market. Right? The first of these is what get called cap and trade or emissions trading markets. And in this, for the most part, this is what happens where a government says, right, we want to reduce our emissions by, let's say, 20% over this time frame. And we are going to regulate all the companies that are the big emitters to do that. But we don't really know, we as the government don't know who finds it the easiest, the cheapest to reduce, right? I don't know if it's going to come from electricity or steel or cement or agriculture or whatever. I don't know where those emissions, and I want them to be done in the cheapest way. And the way that therefore I'm going to do that is I'm going to say to all the companies, here's a bunch of allowances. And at the end of this period, you have to hold enough allowances for your actual emissions, right? The total number of allowances in the system is going to be less than the total amount of emissions, is going to be the target that I want to reduce the emissions by. But those allowances you can trade with each other. right? So if one company finds it really cheap to reduce emissions, they might sit there and say, well, I'm going to go hell for leather. I can switch entirely to wind for my sources, and I'm going to have all these extra allowances, and I'm going to sell them to other companies in other sectors that find it more expensive. The total emissions still go down. I will make some money from selling those things that help me invest again in the future to become even more efficient or even more low carbon, right? And the company that finds it really, really difficult or expensive to reduce emissions will say, actually, the best thing for me to do is just to buy a bunch of extra allowances, because really at this stage, I might invest in some technological change to see if I can in the future, but at the moment, I really can't reduce, right? So that's the logic of a cap and trade market. A regulator is reducing the emissions. The idea of a market is to make the achieving those emissions reductions as efficient as possible. The second sort of market is the idea of a carbon offset market, and that's where, not necessarily guided by an overall cap, somebody might say, either because they're forced to through regulation or just because they want to for good PR, if they're a company, for example, well, I emit this amount of emissions, and I would like to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So what I'm going to do is invest somewhere else in the world or in a project which will reduce the emissions by the same amount as my emissions. And I will count that against my own emissions, right? So those are two rather different ones, but both of which set up essentially a market exchange which is designed to reduce emissions in an economically efficient way. Now, so these were proposed very early on when climate change became an issue on the political agenda in the late 1980s and early 1990s. There were economists starting to propose these as a way of doing it, dealing with climate change for a variety of reasons. But if we think about this in political terms and we ask the question, who wants these markets, right? So there are two answers to this, right? One, for the cap and trade markets, if you're an electricity producer, then it's a really good way of hedging your bets, right? You think, well, I don't want a carbon tax, particularly because that's going to just make my product more expensive, definitely. And I don't want direct regulation because that could be really expensive for me. So if we have to do something about climate change, let's have a cap and trade system. So they like it for that, and lots of the companies that were lobbying for this during the 1990s, in the end successfully, came from those sectors that were going to be regulated and said, well, if we're going to have to do something about emissions, this is our preferred policy choice. So it suits those big corporate interests. The other people, of course, is if you ask this question, who is making money directly out of this? And it's the city traders, right? And most of the trades are being done on stock exchanges. Actually, London is still the centre of this world. It was a very deliberate strategy, the British government, in proposing the EU ETS, because it knew that London was the dominant financial centre and it was a new product line for those city financiers. Right, so it's got a very clear beneficiary in terms of financial sector. And the crude version of this question, and this is why I think it comes back to some of the dilemmas I raised in the previous slide, is if you ask the question to Merrill Lynch or JP Morgan or Barclays Bank, one of the big global banks, what do you think about climate change policy and what should be done about climate change? Then they will probably say, well, don't do anything that's going to harm global economic growth. Don't harm the assets that I've got all these investments in. If you ask those same actors, what do you think about climate change if carbon markets are the central design, they suddenly go, that sounds really interesting, right? So what you've done as a policymaker is shift the coalition of people in favour of climate policy in quite important ways. And it's still the case that lots of the big global banks are actually quite in favour of climate policy. There are all sorts of contradictions. They're still investing in coal and oil all over the place, but nevertheless, they like carbon markets. So that's part of the politics of why carbon markets have become really, really dominant, and that's sort of partly because of these power structures. So the EU ETS is the biggest of these markets. It was developed in the aftermath of the Kyoto Protocol, which was agreed in 1997, the big treaty, the first treaty to have constraints, legally binding constraints on emissions by rich countries. And basically that operates roughly like I described as a cap and trade market across the whole of the EU. It's had through its history, it's had a lot of criticisms, right? There's a number of crises where the price collapsed, and worries about whether it was actually working or not. But one of the interesting things about that is that there's actually been quite a significant evolution of the governance of that, in ways that now lots and lots of commentators who were highly critical 10 years ago now say, well, actually, it's now working an awful lot better than it did. So it's not, so it's, I'm not, I can say lots more about that if people have questions, but I'll better leave it there. Carbon markets, however, have come under an awful lot of criticisms, and I'll give some of them in the next slide. But what's notable is that they're actually still developing, right? In Mexico, it's had a carbon tax in place, a small carbon tax in place since 2014, but actually a pilot cap and trade system started on January the 1st this year, and is due to expand in 2023. I don't claim to be an expert on that particular system, but it's, you know, it's happening in not only in rich countries, but also in developing countries like Mexico. Some of the criticisms of this are, in the bottom one, the cartoon at the beginning one is a very old cartoon in climate politics, and it expresses this idea that, you know, climate politics in terms of the global inequalities is essentially a process whereby rich countries are people in rich countries, gas guzzlers and cars, are telling people in poor countries they're not allowed to cut trees down anymore because of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? So the sort of, and this was actually in a book, in a report produced by scholar activists in India in the early 1990s. Where the title was a global warming, a case of environmental colonialism. And I think that cartoon captures it. So there's an idea, especially in carbon offset markets, effectively, that what is happening in those markets is rich consumers, mostly in the global north, are essentially paying people in the global south not to emit, rather than change their own patterns of emissions. This is also, to an extent, expressed, the one on the bottom right, which was a cartoon that appeared in the New York Times in about 2008. Forgive me, I have SUV'd. This is a very, this is a direct, and this was also produced in a report, there was a report produced, really good report. And again, for those of you with a strong Catholic background, you might remember that the Catholic Church during the late Middle Ages ran what was a market in indulgences, where it was selling to rich sinners indulgences to say, well, you'll have less time in purgatory and so on, and you'll get to heaven quicker. And essentially this criticism here is that the carbon offsets is working exactly the same way. It's a rich consumer is saying, oh, well, I feel so guilty for all my carbon emitting sins, and so how can I get my way? And the carbon offset market comes along and says, here, we can wash all your sins away, and you'll get less time in purgatory. Another one which would happen during the financial crisis was the idea that the carbon market was also essentially a bubble, and that it was unstable. It was just a series of scams, if you like. And in a way, the cartoon right in the middle, the idea that the simple idea that essentially the world is being running through a carbon, or governed through a carbon market, and the future of climate change is being determined by the interests of big bankers and financiers and so on. So there's all sorts of those criticisms, and people, if we want to raise some of those, then happy to talk about those. I turn a little bit to trade now, just to say a few things about that, because I know that you're dealing with that in the course you're in. I think three general points to make, right? One is to think about global trade as a source of emissions, right? Trade has expanded very rapidly in the period after the Second World War. It's been expanded, if you like, as you can also think of that expansion in physical terms, right? It's not just about trading things that we all like in goods. It's also a trade in soil. It's a trade in, when I'm buying my out of season vegetables, that actually, if I'm buying them from Britain, they're not coming from Latin America, but if I was buying them in Canada, they would be coming, my out of season asparagus. I have no idea what that is in Spanish. I'm sorry, somebody might have to translate later. That would be coming from Ecuador or Peru. And if I'm buying that in England, it's coming from Morocco, or beans, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Tomatoes, etc. Right. So that global trade is not only a sort of monetary transaction; it's also a physical transaction where those goods have to be physically moved, those goods have to be produced in that site. So if it's foodstuffs we're talking about, which is a good example, then there's also the emissions associated with the production of those foods, and the export effectively of the embodied soil and so on. But it's in particular, it's the energy involved in transporting those goods, which is two sorts of energy. One is the energy in the physical moving them, in planes and ships and so on. And two, it is, for most of those things, it is also refrigerating them, keeping them cool so they don't rot. Right? This is one of the reasons that bananas are actually not too bad, because bananas, they have their own packaging and you don't refrigerate them. And they have a long shelf life, so they tend to go by ship rather than by plane. So they're not actually anywhere near as bad as some of the other things that we buy from all over the world. So there's transport and aviation shipping is a big sort of the problem. Another thing, a particular thing, of course, about that international shipping and aviation is that those emissions are really hard to regulate. And actually, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does not regulate emissions from international trade. It was delegated in the case of shipping to the International Maritime Organization, in the case of aviation to the International Civil Aviation Organization. And both of those organizations have basically said, we're not going to do anything about climate change. Until very recently, right? They've been very, very slow to act, even though they lobbied very hard to say, we don't want shipping or aviation regulated by the UNFCCC. But anyway, there's a lot of embodied emissions in everything we buy that is moved around the world. And of course, as trade has expanded, that's got a bigger part of emissions. There's also a sort of more dynamic argument about how the globalization of production that trade has enabled, as well as the global economic inequalities in labor costs and things like that, means that production also often, not always, but often shifts from highly efficient, let's take a paradigm example, highly efficient production sites in, let's say, Germany or Sweden, where the electricity is quite decarbonized already, certainly in Sweden's case, a bit less so in Germany's case, to less efficient sites where the energy is more likely to come from coal in, let's say, Mexico, for example, as a guess, but certainly in lots of parts of the world. So you can have a higher amount of embodied emissions in the production because that's enabled by that trade, and a reduced incentive in a country like Germany to become yet more efficient, because if you do so, then the production may just shift elsewhere globally. So that's one aspect of the trade climate change problem. The second one is that global trade, in relation to climate change, is already becoming a source of quite significant political friction, right? So there've been a number of WTO challenges and rulings to do with climate policy. One was brought by the United States against China for claiming that some of the ways that China was exporting solar photovoltaic panels, the solar panels, was under anti-dumping rules in the WTO. Ontario, the province where José Manuel and I used to live, actually José Manuel mostly lived in Quebec, but anyway, had a feed-in tariff, which is a particular way of trying to promote renewable energy in the electricity system. And one of the things they did was they said, well, you must produce a certain percentage of the solar panels or the wind turbines in Ontario. It's called domestic content rule under the WTO, and that was struck down by the WTO. So this idea on some actors that there's a sort of green protectionism problem, but that could at the same time act as a significant brake to actually incentivizing action on climate change. And conversely, you've also got lots of proposals by states and lots of different types of states to say, well, if I've got a greenhouse gas emissions control program in place, which is can be quite costly for some of my industries at least, like the EU ETS that I talked about a minute ago, then I want to say that anybody importing in that is competing with those industries has to have a level playing field. So that if I'm imposing a cost of, let's say, $10 a ton on my aluminium companies in Europe, then I want to be able to impose a 10% carbon tariff on aluminium imports from elsewhere to make that playing field level, unless those countries also have an equivalent sort of carbon price on their aluminium industry. Right? And so that's called a border tariff adjustment, and they apply not only in the carbon context, but you can go carbon border tariff adjustment. And they've been proposed by, the EU has proposed those, or thought about proposing those, when the US was seriously considering legislation on climate change in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, 2009-10, all of the bits of legislation that were there had that built in, thinking of China or Canada or one or two other countries as a target for that tariff. And obviously that is quite easy to see how that's going to be a source of conflict. And the third aspect of the trade climate change relationship, which is important, is the way in which climate action will itself affect trade patterns. So in some senses, it's fairly obvious it'll cause a decline in the trade in some commodities. If we succeed in climate change, there will be no oil trade in 40 years' time. 30 years' time even, actually. If there's still significant oil trade in 30 years' time, we're in really, really big trouble, right? So that's a massive challenge for those countries whose economies are heavily dependent on oil, and they shout loudly about this and want to be compensated for it. But you can just imagine it in terms of the function of the global economy and how it works. It will be a very different world with no oil trade in oil. It's not only those countries, it's also that oil has been central, for example, and still is central to the relative value of the US dollar compared to all other countries. The reason why the US dollar is the linchpin currency in the global economy. And that was established, it was established very explicitly as a oil dollar gold standard after the Second World War. Right? And it still remains really important. And lots of other economies, like Canada, where Canada's currency basically goes up and down with the oil price, really crudely, even though it's not so oil dependent on oil as, say, Saudi Arabia is. The second way that it would affect it is that in lots of places people conceive of climate action as being about relocalization of production. Again, food is a really good example of that. Lots of people talk about their the emissions involved in their food system, not only about what do I eat, right? So the dairy and beef question that I raised earlier on, but also where do I get it from, right? I don't want there to be so much energy embodied in my food because it's been transported halfway around the world. I want to get it from a farmer down the road, and so on. So that and there's lots of good reasons to believe that if we do take the fossil fuels out of the economy, then it does involve in that. And there's obviously big impacts of a variety of ways, not just food, but manufacturing, all sorts of things that would be affected by that. If you think of the Mexican context of the maquiladoras along the American border, it could have significant impacts on manufacturing in that part of the country, right? Because of if you had significant moves to relocalize production, right? Maybe you're having that already because of Trump's wall and completely different source of that sort of relocalization. But climate change could produce that, and with associated dilemmas. And the final one is, of course, that there will be there's good reason to believe there will be new parts of the global economy that were in an electricity-dominated energy system where that electricity is coming from renewables. The renewables are local, right? The sun shines everywhere, more in your country than it does in mine. But it shines plenty here for us to get lots of electricity from sun. Well, it doesn't even need to be shining to get electricity from solar. But the places where lots of the key materials that are needed to construct a solar economy, electricity-based economy, will be significant beneficiaries. Now, they may, of course, at the same time as they become economic beneficiaries, they become the targets of attempts by other states to control them. And so the lithium example I gave earlier, I think, is a good one of that. But it's also the same for copper. Wind turbines have masses and masses of copper in them. It's huge solenoid to generate electricity out of the motion of a wind turbine. And so the places in the world where copper is really, really dominant, and copper, of course, has been, those countries have been in free fall since the early 1980s, because actually copper demand has gone down very radically. Those are having a revival. But again, that revival comes with a sort of threat of sort of instability, because other countries are going to want to control that. Okay, so those are hopefully some general points. If you've got questions about all of those, I just want to finish by saying a little bit about the COVID lockdown, right? And one of the things about the COVID crisis is that lots and lots of states at various levels are thinking about infrastructure. And the infrastructures of daily life that we have are really, really important to the greenhouse gas emissions. Whether we have an urban transport infrastructure, for example, premised on cars, makes a massive difference to one premised on public transport and cycling and walking. Right? Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, for example, has said we need to have 15-minute cities where most people can get everything they need on a daily basis within a 15-minute walk. Right? And that's a response to the crisis that we have, the fact that lots and lots of places have gone into this sort of lockdown that meant that nobody was driving anymore, and suddenly people thought, maybe this is an opportunity to sort of reset the button and do things differently. Right? But also, if you're going to get out of an economic crisis and you're a government, one of the things that governments do to get out of economic crisis all the time is invest in infrastructure. It's the thing that government can do. It can build roads, it can build railways, it can stimulate housing construction, and so on. Right? And so how that happens could be really crucial to whether we set, it's a real opportunity to set a new path for the global economy on a low carbon direction rather than a high carbon direction. So if we think about the key case of transport, which, as José Manuel said at the beginning, I've written a fair bit about, it's about 25% of global emissions. It varies a bit by different countries. And the key thing we have to do is we have to electrify all motorized transport has to be electrified. And not just cars, but trucks, tractors, aeroplanes, trains, everything, right? And all the electricity for those vehicles have to come from zero carbon. It has to be all renewable or nuclear. I'll leave the nuclear question aside. And so there's a lot of, there's another additional point, which is that renewable energy, wind and solar, which have to be part of a solution to the electricity supply, they're intermittent, right? The solar electricity we only get during the day, and wind energy we only get when the wind is blowing. So a persistent question there is how can we store electricity in a way that spreads, means that we can rely on renewable electricity for a greater percentage of the total share than we currently do. And one of the ideas now in terms of transport is that if we shift all our vehicles to electric, then most cars that people own are idle for 23 hours a day. They sat there. And if you have an electric vehicle that's connected to the grid, then that can be storing your electricity. Right? So the intermittency and the grid could draw on a car that's sitting there when there's peak demand in the electricity use to mean that you don't have to have an extra power plant just to power that when you've got peak. So the electrification of transport also solves some problems in shifting the electricity system to fully renewable or very, much more renewable and zero carbon. So that's one answer, and that involves lots and lots of investment in infrastructure, in electric charging, in car batteries, and so on. The other part, though, is that the shifts to low carbon or zero carbon transport, walking, cycling, public transport, are also key. You can't do everything with electric vehicles. There's a lot of emissions involved in building those vehicles in the first place, for example. And here, what we've noticed, lots of people have noticed during the COVID lockdown, is that you get major spin-off benefits in terms of health, in terms of air quality. Most places report now that cycling and walking are radically up, and all other forms of transport are radically down. Right? And people notice, in Britain anyway, it was like suddenly we had 8 weeks of really full lockdown, and the air quality was just extraordinary. Nobody had experienced air quality that good in my entire life in Britain. That was sort of suddenly thought, that would be nice. But of course, that also requires lots and lots of infrastructure investment, which could all be used to accelerate the transformation of the global economy through EV charging infrastructure, cycle lanes, planning to enable walking being much more integral to daily life, public transport infrastructure, and so on. So I think that's where we want to leave you on a sort of hopeful note that we actually, in lots of contexts, COVID could become an opportunity in that context, even if it's horrible in lots of other ways. And I will stop there. I think that's all. Yeah. So if I'm very happy to field lots and lots of questions, so please go ahead, and I hope that's been of use. Shall I unshare my screen, or shall I leave it up to if people want to go back to specific slides? I'll leave it maybe.
Yeah, maybe leave it. It's a good idea. We'll wait for Professor Aceves to keep moderating.
Thank you very much. I think it has been definitely provocative, instructive. Thank you very much, Professor Paterson. We have several questions. Some of them have already been answered or partially answered, but there's an enormous interest in our students, and some of the questions are around obviously transition. Andres Aranda, which is a student of ours, asks, how can Latin American governments promote development and growth while neutralizing our emissions, which are clearly a long way from becoming independent from fossil fuels? Is that feasible or realistic from your point of view? I chose this question particularly because Latin America has been long discussing about energy transition, but it just doesn't appear to occur. So what are your insights regarding these questions and the issue?
Well, I mean, one response, of course, is to go back to the first point I made, which is that if Latin American societies, or European, or American, or Australian, or Asian, doesn't matter where, don't, then the consequences are really, really bad. And you won't, I mean, I suppose you could also say, at the extreme, the question contains an oxymoron, not because anybody's daft, but because if we don't transform development in a way that it does become zero carbon, and we don't get the fossil fuels out of the economy, then there won't be any development anyway. Right? Any forms of development that those governments are trying to promote will be undermined progressively by climate change impacts. So that's one response. I mean, I think in terms of the other aspect of the question, in terms of the how, then, I mean, one thing in a way I think that it's an aspect where the sort of developed country divide is not actually very useful, right? That actually the situations that governments face around the world are not that different, right? The amount of wealth to be able to chuck money at things might be a little bit. But the types of problems, and actually you need to read, what you need to read to do is read José Manuel's PhD, because his PhD is about Mexico City and Lima and promoting transport initiatives, right? And there he could have written that about Amsterdam or Chicago or Shanghai, right? And actually, but it's actually quite instructive to think not about national government leaders, but about city government managers, because actually cities around the world, the city managers who are they're having to do most of this work, right? It is our urban infrastructure is a really important part of it. Housing, planning, transport, and so on are crucial too, and industrial development, right? How a city tries to promote and attract employment and investment and so on. All those are really crucial. And actually, if you're a city manager in Chicago or in Guadalajara, the issues you're facing on a daily basis are quite similar, right? You're managing transport, you're managing congestion, poor air quality, complaints by citizens about X, Y, and Z that are to do with those types of issues. And they dominate city politics everywhere. So we're quite similar in that regard. And also, even when we zoom back up to the national level, on the one hand, rich countries might be thought to have much more resources, administrative capacity, and so on to be able to govern climate change. They also, of course, undeniably have more historical responsibility for causing climate change in the first place. Right? But that's maybe that moral. Then that's the question of how much political purchase does that moral argument have in practice? And I'm a bit of a skeptic about that. But if you're a national government, you're dealing with not dissimilar dilemmas, however much different capacity you might have to do with it. But it's about pretty much everywhere there is not a lot of public pressure to do anything about climate change. There is not necessarily a lot of political payoff to do it, because the climate change benefits of any politician's action now will never be felt in that politician's lifetime, let alone their time in office, right? Because it's 30 to 40 years before we would ever see the benefit. Plus it's a global problem, they're only one country, etc. So there's all sorts of reasons why, there's all sorts of incentive structures that make it very difficult for politicians to really want to act in terms of the climate benefits. So you have to articulate it with other benefits, right? And urban air quality is always going to be a win-win, right? There are, doing that, or almost always, one or two exceptions. If you're going to act on climate change on the transport sector or housing sector or other aspect or industrial development and regulation of industry and so on, then you're going to get those sorts of spin-off benefits in terms of health, air quality, and so on, in a way that might benefit a politician, right? I got our air better is a much better electoral sell than I made people in 40 years' time better all over the world, but maybe a little bit here as well. Right? That's not a very good political sell. Whereas the immediate benefits are much better. But there is good cause for to have loads of those benefits, but you're never going to get the public political pressure driving it, right? So it's either a combination, and the public opinion surveys around the world show this very clearly. There's even places where climate change is strong on the well, even places where climate change action is at its foremost, and countries that have got their emissions under control. Britain is one of them, ironically, but Sweden, to an extent, Germany, although Germany's faltering for a time. South Korea, but South Korea is now faltering. Then those, you can't explain those by reference to public opinion. It's not driven by that. It's driven by the ability to generate other benefits, some of which are going to be the electoral ones that I sketched, like air quality or health or whatever, but some of them are going to be the corporate ones, doing things that benefit their friends in the city or the companies that they're allied to. So I think if, in terms of the question, then it's getting politicians to think about how dealing with climate policy makes our economy better. But the sense of an imperative of getting the fossil fuels out, which is absolutely necessary from a climate change point of view, they have to sort of internalise via a route that's not about winning electoral games, because that's unlikely to ever be enough pressure for that to generate that.
Very well.
Helps.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Daniel Munoz poses a very interesting question about degrowth. He says, with this strong correlation between economic growth and the increasing of carbon emissions, what are the alternatives? He asks, is it possible to have negative emissions technologies? And finally, is degrowth a real solution to the countries from the global south or even to the global north?
That's a lot of questions.
I know.
I mean, the partisans of degrowth, the people who advocate for degrowth, people like Georgios Kallis and others, are fairly clear that you have to think about that at the global level, and that's about a redistribution of the benefits of the economy. And so it may be that some parts of the world still experience economic growth, but it's compensated by decline in GDP in rich countries. So they're fairly attentive to that global justice question, and in fact lots of them are quite strongly allied to sort of what get called climate justice movements and so on. They are, I think, quite strong on the arguments of this, if you like, the co-benefits of acting on climate change, right? So some of the ways in which COVID has become an opportunity, thought of as an opportunity in the ways I briefly sketched, are sorts of arguments that the degrowth people are actually being saying for years. Right? We can make ourselves all more healthy, have more time, have more, etc. by degrowing, and lots of aspects of the growth of the economy, even certainly in middle income countries like Mexico, is driven by frivolous consumption needs of relatively wealthy people getting more and more goodies, and not actually by human needs, right? So they would make that point, and the growth is driven essentially by the logic of capitalism, not by the logic of making us all better off. And those two things are not the same thing. I think the degrowth arguments are weakest on the sorts of points I made about capitalism as a sort of power structure, that they're not always very good at recognizing that if you're going to say we need a degrowing economy, then what you are saying is this is an anti-capitalist economy. This is actually a post-capitalism that we're pursuing. Because capitalism, to my mind, capitalism, if you have a no-growth economy, capitalism dies. It cannot survive without growth. Right? So that's, if you are going for degrowth, you are going for something that's not capitalism, and you have to think about what that looks like, because that's actually really profound. It's even more profound than just the transformations of technology and culture and so on that I was talking about earlier on. I think the other way into that question, though, is to say that it's still not obvious to me that even though those numbers that I sketched, I hope I explained those clearly enough, it's quite, how rapidly the economy has to decarbonize. It's not 100% obvious to me that a capitalist economy can't be sufficiently flexible that it can decouple from fossil fuel energy. There's a lot of paradoxes and contradictions, right? That in order to shift that fast, you actually have to spend a lot of carbon, right? There's a lot of carbon in the steel in the wind turbines that has to be made now from relatively high carbon energy. So the transition itself has carbon involved in producing it. Ditto with mining all of those nasty rare earth metals that are in solar panels or in lithium batteries is very energy intensive. So there's that type of issue in the transition, but it seems to be nevertheless, in principle, consistent with some ways of thinking about capitalism as a highly dynamic system, that it could do that really, really rapidly. You do see periods of very rapid change in capitalism in other areas. We've never seen one actually in energy. So there is a question of, is energy sort of special compared to, let's say, but we've seen, well, that said, a lot of the really rapid transitions we have seen in the past have happened in two circumstances. One is they've happened because they've accelerated high carbon economies. And the other is that they've happened in wartime. Right, so the World War II was a massive exercise in increasing greenhouse gas emissions. And you saw huge swathes, for example, of the American economy switched over from whatever production it was doing before to producing jeeps and tanks and bombers and planes and so on, other bits of war material. And so you see a massive expansion in oil consumption by the US military. You, of course, also see a massive decline in greenhouse gas emissions by the population as a whole, because you have rationing, you have strict controls on, there's in the UK, there's these famous posters about, I forget the exact tenor, but basically, if you're driving your car, you're doing Hitler a favor. Hitler is always driving with you, and there's these posters. I think it's got a picture of somebody driving their car with Hitler next to them in the passenger seat, right? So it's, there's really strong push to get people not to drive, not to consume, because that stuff's needed for the war effort. So the population decreases its greenhouse gas emissions, but greenhouse gas emissions as total go up because of that rapid transition towards a war economy. But it doesn't necessarily follow to me that, in principle, the same sort of, quotes, emergency mobilization couldn't be engaged in towards decarbonisation. It's not, if you like, a technical question. That it's really a question of, could you get the politics right to mobilise that rapidly? Not. And of course, then the obvious question: could you do that in outside wartime, when the only experience we have of those sorts of transformations is in wartime, effectively?
Very well. Well, this last sentence was, for me, truly instructive and truly scary, Professor.
Yes, I agree.
Mariel Papan Manjarres from Laval University, who are also watching this morning, says, you highlighted the very strong links between climate change and capitalism, but also alluded to the fact that capitalism and climate action might be compatible. How? How do you think a transformative change is possible under the capitalist system? I think this question directs several of the doubts that we have received from our students as well.
Well, I share those doubts. I think absolutely it is possibly the case that capitalism can't transform rapidly. I certainly think that those sorts of anti-capitalist arguments or doubts are much more well founded in our empirical understanding of how societies work and the history of how energy has been used and the economy works and so on. That's a much more solid argument than the opposite argument, which you will get from business leaders and some economists and those promoting sort of the boosters of capitalism, if you like. There is actually another book called Climate Capitalism, which came out, I think, a year after ours, written by Hunter S. Lovins, who is a well-known American sort of, she's part of a think tank called the Rocky Mountain Institute. And so sort of consulting, working with businesses, really, really technologically optimistic, and really, really enthusiastic for how entrepreneurial business is and how much they can disrupt and change everything and so on. So there's that view. That view, to my mind, is nonsense, right? To assert definitively we know that capitalism can transform, well, is indefensible is incompatible with what we know about the world. It's not so obvious that the opposite argument, it doesn't follow that the opposite argument is definitely true, right? So I'm it's not like I'm much closer to the anti-capitalist argument that the question expresses than I am to those boosters. But nevertheless, I think we have to ask, because of the time question, we aren't going to end up in a non-capitalist world in time. Sure. And even if we had a non-capitalist world, it would still have to transform itself enormously. It would still have to find a way to get rid of all of the carbon in the cement and the steel. It would still have to find a way to get around and do all the investments in infrastructure that we aren't getting around in fossil fuel cars. It would still have to do X, Y, and Z, right? Huge amounts of transformations happen, whether the society is capitalist or not. I think you can come up with arguments for why it's a bit easier if you don't have this sort of profit motive and growth imperative driving forward how society responds. I think that's a reasonable argument. But nevertheless, that's the world we have. So the question then still becomes to me is, can we imagine a way that it could? And I think what you then have to work with is an inbuilt logic to innovation, not just in the narrow technical sense, but to sort of disruptive innovation or whatever. The economist Schumpeter called it gales of creative destruction, that periodically the economy sort of transforms itself in some important ways. That then has to be radically, you have to find political ways and governance ways of directing that transformation rather than just letting it happen, because you really want, it's just as possible, for example, with the COVID lockdown now, that we actually end up with governments saying, there's a pressure, for example, in the UK government context to build lots and lots of houses really quickly to provide jobs for building workers to deal with, it won't deal with the homelessness problem actually, because that's because people haven't got any money to afford, but it will deal with a range of issues in the housing market, might bring housing prices down a bit, etc., etc. But they're actually talking about relaxing things like energy efficiency or regulations to make that housing, or where they can be built. So we're going to get more houses built in floodplains, which are just going to get flooded periodically, because we have regular flooding in Britain because it rains a lot where I live.
Mm-hmm.
So there's plenty of possibilities of it going in absolutely the wrong direction. But it seems to me that the capitalism's tendency to be enormously dynamic is the thing that you have to try and work with. But it's also the thing that is the source of all the lots and lots of dilemmas, right? Because carbon markets were highly innovative, and they have produced all sorts of dilemmas about winners and losers and who's getting climate justice issues and so on that are absolutely real.
Thank you.
I think the short answer is there are no guarantees anyway. Right? There are no guarantees.
The only certain thing is that we live in times of uncertainty, right? Alma Ruby Puga, which is another student of our master, says regarding innovation, disruption, change of paradigm, mindset, what would be the possibilities for the introduction of a perspective that takes into account the functions of nature, the biophysical criteria as pointed out by ecological economics in international political economy?
Cool, good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer. I mean, the last book that I had out that, as Emmanuel mentioned, the ecology and the politics of, in global political economy, an ecological approach to global political economy. Now I'm thinking ecologically about the global political economy, that's the title. So we do have a bit of an engagement with ecological economics in there, and to sort of think about, I mean, there's a number of things from a political economy point of view where ecological economics is often weak, one of which is the growth question, the same as I just mentioned in relation to degrowth, right? They'll talk about a steady state economy coming from Herman Daly and so on. But actually, and some of them will now talk about degrowth as well, but they don't think about why it is we live in a world that cannot countenance a lack of growth. Right? So, but I think the point in terms of standard economics, the extension of thinking about how the global economy is a material thing, that's where matter and energy and flows of that is important, I think, is really crucial contribution of ecological economics to how we think about the economy. I'm not certain beyond that how to respond. I don't know if they want to sort of follow up or if that responds. Not sure that was a very good answer, but anyway.
I think that is instructive, definitely. And besides, I think that it is clear that governments all around the world and citizens also have to be creative, and we have to learn if we want to continue living in a post-capitalist era. Diana Estefania Garcia poses another question that might be relevant. To reach a transition and reduce greenhouse emissions, do you think it is important to adopt a circular economy, especially in Latin America? I believe that there is an enormous buzz, personally, about circular economy, but I also personally have doubts that it will pose a difference. Is there any difference from your point of view?
Well, I actually work with quite a lot of, I will come back to the previous question as well in a sec, and maybe I'll do that first because I remembered the bit that I'd missed, which is about the sort of what sometimes get called nature-based solutions, right? So there's very clear and negative emissions points as well. Maybe that was a previous question as well, that
exactly.
There's plenty of evidence that, you know, so first point, to get to you saw in that thing that we might need to get to below zero. We have negative emissions in the system sense, not in terms of a specific technology, right? The obvious way that that is going to happen is by absorbing carbon through biological sources, right? So afforestation, wetland management, in places like the UK, actually upland moor management, there's a lot of peat that is currently a source of carbon but can become a sink if it's properly managed. And in urban areas also things like urban afforestation to do things like essentially function like natural forms of air conditioning, so that you use less energy in buildings because you're naturally keeping the temperature lower in streets through sort of canopy and so on. So that, I think that on that previous question, I think that's a key part. It's also one where there is actually lots of activity already, and because especially in urban contexts, there's lots of co-benefits. Right, and how that does, I mean, the other point I suppose is that's also very locally specific, right? If you're in UK, mild, damp, winter's getting wetter and they were wet already, then flooding is the real issue that we have, right? And about 1 winter in 3 now, some part of the UK is quite dramatically flooded. And I live in a town which has a very, very narrow gorge-like river coming off the hills nearby, and it only takes, it's a matter of luck whether it's us or the towns in the next valley really which get flooded when we get big rainfall. But so that how you need to do those sort of nature-based solutions, where you need to put the trees, how you need to allow houses to be built in different places, where you put different sorts of green infrastructure, as it sometimes gets called, will vary. And whether flooding is your issue or overheating is your issue, it's going to be a different type of solution. Trees are often a big part of any solution for lots of those things. But anyway, so circular economy. I actually work with quite a lot of colleagues. I'm a director of an institute at Manchester called the Sustainable Consumption Institute. And a lot of my colleagues are circular economy people. One of the things I think is interesting about the way that they do it, at least, is that to say that economies can become circular in lots and lots of different ways, right? So there's a really hard sort of technical material science, engineering, corporate-driven one where, just essentially we're mimicking nature by saying every output has to become an input to something else, and nothing is wasted in the system, right? So all of the time, at the end of a product's life, it's absolutely completely recycled and repurposed into something else. So I do have some colleagues, for example, working on polyester textiles and trying to find out new ways to completely break down polyester so that all this fast fashion textiles can be repurposed and doesn't end up in landfill. So that's one way, but I also have colleagues talking about how doing projects with people about how you make the product circular by, if you've come across institutions called repair cafes. There's a movement called the Repair Cafe movement where they run in, and there's actually one again in my small town that runs where they meet once a month, and you take your old electronics there, and there's old guys who like to play nothing better than to play around with electronics and make your old radio work again. Right? And so that's another way, and so community-oriented ways of extending product life and keeping something in use, and that could be with electronics for that example, or clothing, or whatever, furniture, that keep things in circuit, keep objects moving around and reduce the material throughput in this roughly the same sort of way, but without it being really hard, technical, chemical, whatever orientation, and also therefore paying much more attention to the, if you like, the regulation of production such that those objects are repairable in the first place, right? So there's also a right to repair movement, which, these phones, right? They've been built such that if it goes wrong, I cannot mend it. Right? I would, even if I had the technical skill, I would not be physically able to do it. You can't get even to do that. It's designed to prevent people from repairing them, and so regulatory moves to regulate production such that it has to become circular. It seems to me that, even with the slightly more relaxed thing, just like a focus on recycling. It's not always obvious that recycling is, from a narrowly climate point of view, always the best thing, right? If you take paper, recycling paper is not a particularly good idea from a climate point of view. It takes as much energy to recycle that paper, if not more, than it does to build it in the first place. And you might be better off thinking about ways of, for example, storing paper in other ways of repurpose, so not just recycling, but reusing it as insulation or something else, because there's going to be a fire risk if it's insulation, but where you are storing the embodied carbon in the paper without having to expend a load of mechanical energy to do that, which you would have to do to recycle it. So it's not always that circularity is necessarily the best thing from a climate point of view. It may be good from other points of view, but it's not necessarily the best thing from a climate point of view, where one of the things you're having to try to do is minimize energy use. Recycling, if steel, aluminium, metals generally, all of your rare earths that are sat in your phone, when the phone comes to an end of life, those are absolutely crucial, right? Because the mining is where the energy is, and the amount of energy involved in recycling aluminium is way, way lower than that's involved in mining the bauxite in the first place and then transforming it into aluminium in the first place. But for glass, for example, is quite ambivalent. Glass uses about the same amount of energy to recycle it as it does to produce it in the first place.
Sure.
But so what you need to do with glass is reuse, right? You need those bottle back systems where the glass, because as soon as the glass is broken, it has to be melted to make glass again. But if you don't break it, and you're taking it back and they fill it with beer again, and then you drink the beer and then you take it back and they fill it with beer again, then that's brilliant. So it's all quite variable depending on the materials that we're dealing with, whether circularity is going to, or in what ways circularity is going to help you. But also then I think pluralizing what we mean when we say circularity, I think is a good thing. So it's not always this high-tech transformation by some corporation that wants to control that process. It could be quite community oriented and so on.
Yeah, well, I have another provocative question from Jorge Villaseñor, which I'm going to rephrase a little. What can millions of people that live under the poverty line in the global South do to change the perspective and collaborate to this transformation? Because I am listening several proposals, obviously all of them valuable, meaningful, degrowth, ecological economics. I believe that there's not only one way or not one exclusive way, if I may put it. What do you think?
Yes, there's multiple pathways, so definitely. I mean, I think that the first part of the question, somebody who's extremely poor in the global South or extremely poor in the global North, well, actually there is a nuance to make there. But certainly most people who are extremely poor in the global South, at one level you could just say, don't worry about it, it's not your problem, you didn't cause the problem, you're not causing climate change now. You got more important things to worry about in terms of subsisting. And probably the best thing you could do is mobilize politically and say, we need politicians and the rich to act. Right? So become parts of political coalitions and go on marches if you've got time and energy and you're in a place where that might make a difference. That's actually probably the most effective thing that they could do, right? They can't do anything about their own emissions because their own emissions are probably, like I said in that graph, they're down to below 1 ton per person. And actually the emissions they do are basically mostly completely things beyond their control. Right? So in that sense, there is a slight difference between, let's say, people who are very poor in the global North, say someone like Britain, because the absolute emissions of poor people in the global North will still be higher, even if they're at the same level of sort of really marginal existence, because the houses that they will live, the flats they will live in, will still have electricity that's got emissions that come from somewhere, and they will be using urban infrastructure that has got embodied emissions in it from the concrete and so on. Even if they're just walking around, even if they don't have to own a car or whatever, but if they take a bus, etc., those things. So the infrastructure in a global North country is likely to mean that the emissions of somebody who's highly, very poor at the bottom of that social inequality are going to be quite different. But nevertheless, their situation is very similar in the sense that they will have virtually zero control over their emissions anyway, in ways that relatively wealthy people will have some control. But the other point there is that most of us at the individual level, I mean, it's partly a general point about individual level action, whether you're rich or poor, is that, or no, maybe not rich, let's leave aside the really rich, right? The Bill Gateses, let's leave them out of it. But that most people on relatively affluent middle class incomes don't control most of the emissions that they quotes cause, right? If I say, if I have average British emissions, which are about 7 tons per capita, very low for an industrialized country, about third the per capita emissions of the US or Canada, then and those emissions have gone down actually from about 11. So they've come down quite dramatically. Now that's not because people in Britain are virtuous. Very clearly that's not the case, or no more virtuous or less virtuous than anybody else. It's because the systems and virtually none of that change has been determined by anything individuals have chosen to do. Right? It's come because governments have, first in the 1980s, decided to go all-out war against the coal miners' union, and then on the back of that, privatized the electricity system and wanted to rig the privatized electricity in favor of natural gas over coal, not because they were doing something about climate change. Then they realized, oh, this is quite good for our carbon emissions. We can start to tell a good climate change story. They became climate leaders, and then they thought, well, actually, okay, now we've, having broken the back of the coal mining unions as power, they then found it relatively easy to completely get rid of coal. And Britain went 54 days, it's the longest consecutive days, I think, of any country since we've become industrial economies, without burning any coal in the electricity system this year. Essentially during lockdown, well, in the early part of lockdown, we had a relatively warm period for us, and we basically burnt no coal. But the ability to do that was, of course, the politics of the 1980s and Thatcher, and it was all really nasty. It's not because we're nice. And so individual action, even for relatively affluent people, is more or less, it's not irrelevant, but it's not going to drive the big system transformation anyway. So it's always going to be driven by either some combination of government seeing the opportunities in the transition, companies seeing the opportunities in the transition, pressure from social movements and so on. And I said earlier on, public opinion doesn't matter. I still think that doesn't matter. Popular mobilization can really matter, but that's about concerted collective action. That's not, some opinion poll. That doesn't.
Of course,
it's how it's mobilized, right? So people getting out on the street or being involved in really interesting campaign groups or organizing in their local community, that can have loads of effect. And that, again, that could be people. It's not independent of wealth, because obviously people along the income spectrum have different types of resources available to them, but nevertheless, it's something that it would be definitely the most important thing in terms of actually affecting the transition that somebody right at the bottom of the income spectrum could do, is to be involved politically. Right.
Professor Paterson, unfortunately, time is of the essence. And I'm afraid that we have to start closing up. I would like to ask you if you have any final remarks that you would like to make to our students and our audience before we have to leave.
No, I think no. I mean, just to underscore the main point is that if you're studying and you're thinking about the trajectory of the global economy, contemporary dynamics of the global economy, even if you don't care about climate change, right? It seems to me it's the fact. Or this is the first time you've ever thought about it, it is going to be the case, whether you're thinking about trade or finance or global economic governance. You only have to look at a G7 or a G20 summit, and they talk about climate change every year, except when Trump is hosting it. And even then, everybody else talks about it. He just didn't. He just left the room when they did. Then it's central to how the next, the rest of your lives is going to play out in terms of how the global economy is organized. It's going to be the central conflict on the agenda of the big global organizations every year for the rest of your
lives. The elephant in the room.
Well, I don't think it is an elephant in the room anymore. And I think the elephant in the room is that the elephant, in terms of what I said, I think to the extent there's an elephant in the room, it's that people have still not quite got their grips around how big the transformation is. They might have actually got rid of the head more around the speed question, right? How fast we have to get emissions down, but thinking about how that changes everything. From global summits and what they talk about and what decisions they make, to corporate boardrooms, to universities, right? To you know, to their daily lives, to what houses we live in, to how we move around, to what we eat. All of that. You know,
what we eat, how we transport, what we do,
yeah,
how we connect,
yeah.
exactly.
I suppose one question I like to ask people, or I think is a useful thing, because it speaks really to the depth of the cultural point I made earlier on, is if you think about that slide where I detailed all those multidimensional transformations, but you think about daily life in particular, ask yourself what you will miss the most if we live in a zero carbon world. Most people think the answer, at least for wealthy academics like me, it's flying. But I don't give that answer. I think I would get used to that. I mean, and maybe COVID's getting people used to the idea of not flying around all the place. I mean, I don't fly very often anyway, for an academic. But I do. But I say cooking with natural gas, because cooking in the UK is all on natural gas. And as soon as I moved to Canada, I got rid of the crappy electric cooker and bought a natural gas one. And then I lived on a farm and I cooked on propane. And I would, you know, you have so much more control. Anybody who loves to cook will know that cooking on gas is immeasurably better than cooking on electric.
I can relate. I definitely can relate, Dr. Paterson.
And I will miss that, I think. And you know, I'm in my 50s, so I don't have that long to look back. I won't have that much time to rue it once we do go to entirely electric cooking, which will have to happen very quickly in the next 10 years, basically.
Well.
But ask yourself what you'll miss, and because then I think you'll get a sense of how deep the transformation is.
Thank you, Professor Paterson. It's definitely been very instructive. It's interesting. It's provocative. It's something that in a master's like ours, we all should be talking about. I am truly honored. I thank you very much for your knowledge, for your time, for your humbleness and your openness. And I look forward to having you again at the University of Guadalajara for the Masters in International Relations, Economics and Cooperation.
It'd be a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.